So I really appreciate the opportunity to do this yet again. I do enjoy these talks. As I've told her before, I use these as excuses usually to go investigate a topic that I want to learn better, because the best way to learn something is to go teach it to somebody else. So this one is around the art and science of vendor selection, which may seem like a very strange topic for security. But if you haven't had the experience before, security is just like any other business function. We buy and procure services and solutions all over the place. I was at a event I think it was this last Monday, and there were a couple CISOs there, and they were talking about how many tools they had running around. And I mean software and hardware tools, just to be clear there. And one of them had, I think, 82 tools that they had purchased over the years. One had 83. I didn't know there was a competition for these things, but apparently it's true. We do not have quite as many at my current place of work, but needless to say, there are a lot of services and a lot of things that the business buys, even if it's not security. And from a security architecture perspective, my team gets involved pretty much all the major RFPs across the company, as many as we can, so that we can ensure from a security perspective that we are purchasing something that is not adding more risk, or we're trying to limit the risk by introducing this new partnership. We're going to talk through this and hopefully it makes a little more sense. First, real quick, this is just a quick overview. I do this every time, of who I am, where I'm from, where I've been, all that good stuff. I actually just changed titles yet again as of last week. So I have gone through a couple of iterations around security architecture over the last couple of years. So Director of Security Architecture, then Director of Security Architecture and Engineering, and now I'm Director of Security Architecture and Data Security. So still trying to figure out what exactly does that mean for me and what I'm doing. But the architecture theme has continued throughout for the last couple of years, which I enjoyed the most. So just quick overview there. I have a personal WordPress blog that I publish to, as well as you can find me on LinkedIn. Those are usually the best ways to get a hold of me. Okay, so for today, we're going to go through a bunch of different agenda items here. I'm not going to read through all of them. The goal of the presentation is to understand, when do we conduct an RFP? Does that RFP process typically look like? How do you make a decision during that process? What are some of the things you should avoid? What happens after the RFP? And what we are not going to talk about is how to write business requirements, although that is the key to having a successful RFP, as we will see. All right, so RFP, RFQ, or RFI. There's lots of different terms. Some companies use one versus another. However, they do actually have definitions, so I wanted to put those out here. An RFI is really when you don't know what you need. So you put out a request for information and you're going to basically get back some kind of high level, this is what we can offer you. These are cost estimates or ranges. It's not usually tailored specifically to your problem that you're trying to solve. They'll give architectural overviews. They're general information about services that these companies can provide. It's not designed to really help you get to a decision, but it's enough to educate you on, okay, now I know how to go back and research this and come back with an actual RFP. The RFP itself, right, is when you know what you need, you don't know how to implement it, or you don't know how much it will cost, or both. And so this is where you're going to ask for, you're going to come in with your requirements, say, this is what I think I need. This is my problem statement, and how would you solve this for me? And you go out and you bid it out to a bunch of companies. And then typically you'll get back a detailed overview of how they're going to meet your requirements, the services they offer, and the cost information, so that you can come up with a direction and a recommendation on how to proceed. A request for quote is really where you know what you need, you know how to implement it. All you want to know is, can you do it for my budget? And there you're going to get back the itemized list of the products or the services and their costs. So hopefully that helps clear up a little bit the ABC soup there. So the process. This is like any other business process or project. You have to have requirements. You have to gather your requirements, and that includes budget, right? Don't forget as a security practitioner, we tend to always gravitate towards our security requirements, but don't forget the business, the driving business needs for whatever it is you're trying to do. Because ultimately, not only do you need it to meet your technical and people and process requirements, but you also need to meet the business need and be able to justify it as part of a business case to say, this is why we're going to go purchase this or implement it, etc. You need to identify the vendors that you want to invite to participate, right? You can make it open and say, publicize it basically and say, anybody that comes across this, if you want to bid, you're welcome to. Or you may be more targeted and say, hey, I'm going to talk to some of the larger research companies in town, whether it be a Gartner or somebody equivalent, and say, who are the top 4 or 5 people in this space or companies in this space, and then you may only go and ask them to participate. Once you know who you're going to target, you also need to develop your template for how you're going to score your requirements, essentially, so that the vendors can provide you back information in a way that you can consume it, you can compare it, and ultimately, hopefully come up with a decision. You send that out, you get their responses. You'll typically hold presentations. It is optional, but especially if you haven't seen their tool before in a demo or something, this is a good opportunity to get introduced to it and get feedback that's going to be a little more qualitative, essentially, to what they're providing versus RFP. You're going to go through and score the presentations and responses. And you're going to want to include all of your stakeholders in that process, not just security, but let's say we'll talk about it actually in a few minutes, so never mind. Let's hold on that. You're going to down select and hopefully come out with 1 or 2 potential vendors that you want to move forward with. If it's something like hardware or software or some solution you have to go implement, and it's not just services, you're going to want to do some sort of proof of concept typically. Make sure that what you're purchasing really meets your requirements. It is optional, but a lot of times I've seen it where we try to take at least 2 vendors through that process, compare them, and then down select yet again and make sure we're really choosing the right one to move forward with. Number 9, you'll choose your winner. You're going to have to then go through a whole contracting, negotiation, and signing process, which can take longer than RFP, unfortunately. I've seen it take a good 6-9 months sometimes to get through MSAs and all the contracts and legal work. And then ultimately, you'll get to actually kick off your project and go implement, assuming that the POC implementation was not sufficient. But typically, there's going to be at least some operationalization component of the proof of concept where now you have to roll it out and make sure everybody is using it. It's a high level. That's the process. We're going to drill down into these a bit more. There's a lot of steps, but hopefully it's fairly straightforward. Okay, so who participates in this? There's a lot of different groups. What I was trying to do is say, here's all the different phases, and here's the major players. Obviously, it's going to differ depending on the context and what you're trying to do. But in general, there'll be somebody who's the champion and or the project manager that needs to run this. So they're going to be involved in everything. You're going to have procurement, typically that's going to help. They need to understand and help guide which vendors to reach out to. Maybe there's a vendor you've had some experience with in the past, good or bad, right? You need to understand that from their perspective. They can help with making sure that your templates are put together in a consumable fashion because they have experience with dealing with multiple vendors, seeing the types of responses you get back. They can be that intermediary so that you don't have to be the primary contact for all these vendors. So they're not pinging you at all times of the day trying to get information. They can sit in between and be that buffer, which is very nice. They can help coordinate. They can help with the scoring, making sure that it's documented properly in case a vendor was to get upset, right, and come back and say, hey, we want you to redo this or whatever. That way procurement is basically collecting the evidence that, no, we went through the due process. We did our due diligence as we went through this process. They can help choose the winner, and then ultimately they come in handy when you're doing the contract negotiation and going through the pricing, et cetera, to try to negotiate and get the best deal. So they're heavily involved as well. Legal, they can be involved earlier on, but typically they're mostly around the contract negotiation and reviewing. They're going to need to know your requirements so that they can make sure those are accurately reflected in your contract. And so that when you sign that, right, you're getting the services that you actually want. But they really are mostly involved in the contract itself, not necessarily the rest of the RFP. You'll have a business champion. Like I said, that might be the project manager, depending on the scope of the project or the RFP. That is somebody that is the primary driver that is bringing forward that business case to say this is what we need and why. They're typically going to be involved, at least to some extent, throughout all the phases. You'll have business stakeholders, right? So let's say, I'm going to use this example later, but let's say you're buying a car, right? So if you're buying it for yourself, but let's say you have a significant other, right? You're the primary business champion, you're buying the car for yourself, but your significant other is a business stakeholder. They have a key part of the experience of the car that they're going to have to live with now, right? And so you want to make sure it's something that's going to meet both your needs as best as possible. So they're going to be coming along and they're going to help provide requirements. This might be a stakeholder. Let's say it's for your SIM, right? So a security event and incident or security event logging systems or solution, right? Monitoring. So you're going to have your stakeholders on the front end of that, which is basically your applications and your systems that are going to be feeding logs into your system. So they're going to have requirements on, hey, these are the types of logs I can give you. This is this format I can give you, etc. And then you'll have stakeholders on the other end of the SIM, which would be your operational folks that are looking at the SIM and have to report out on it, etc. Both of those are on both ends of that process. They will have their own set of requirements and they should be included throughout the process and make sure that what you're purchasing is going to meet their needs as well as your own. And then obviously the vendors. So the vendors are not included in all of this, but they're going to be giving you their responses. They're going to be doing presentations. They're going to help with the proof of concepts to demo their solutions. They're obviously going to be involved during the contract negotiations and then the actual kickoff. So high level, these are the major groups that are involved and how they play a role in the process. If anybody has questions, I can't view the chat, unfortunately, at this point, but Herb, if you want to call out something, I'm happy to pause if there's a good point or good question. All right, so how do we choose a vendor? Part one. So like I mentioned, you should conduct market research, right, to figure out who do you want to include. That can be done in-house. It could be done through an external consultancy, like I mentioned. You want to make sure that if you have some minimum requirements that the vendors that get included should meet those, so you don't even have to review them, right? You don't want to have to, you're assuming some basics are being met. You don't want to have to validate that during the RFP. Just get that done up front. So for example, there could be a minimum revenue requirement, right? You don't want to necessarily do business with a mom and pop shop. If you're a global company, that just introduces a certain risk that you may not want to even consider. Or it might be, I need a global or regional or country specific presence. Right now it's really hard to do business with anybody that has a hotel in Russia. We had hotels in Russia up until not too long ago. And so finding vendors and suppliers that could support in certain countries can be quite challenging depending on the context of what's going on in the world. Or it might be, I need a vendor that can support something in China. From a security perspective, that can be very challenging to find somebody that is licensed and or available to provide support depending on the country or the region. So those are things that a lot of times you can figure out up front and kind of scope down to say, okay, is this vendor in or out? Even from the beginning, so I don't have to spend too much time wasting time there. Going back to requirements. So you're going to go through, you're going to sketch out what you need, but you also have to write your requirements in a way that you can actually validate them, right? If you have an open-ended question that's very hard to score, it's going to be very hard to come up with a way to decide between vendor A versus vendor B. So writing your validation criteria for a requirement, just like you would for a test case, for example, if you're doing coding, is key in order to be able to come out with a solution or a decision at the end. So some examples here, right, is data encrypted when the solution is passing data in transit? That's a yes or no thing that you can validate. Is it encrypted at rest? Yes or no? What type of encryption is provided? That one's going to be a little more challenging, but you might have criteria of, I have to have AES 256. If you can't provide that, then I can't consider your solution. I'm being a little extreme here, but You want to be able to know, how am I going to validate that that type of encryption meets my requirements? Is the data ever decrypted to load into another system? If you've got to go through multiple process steps, then is that okay? Is that going to meet your requirements if the requirement is I need encryption end to end? And things like who has access to the decryption key. So for example, in a SaaS solution, a lot of times you don't have an option. They encrypt your data for you. You may not have the key yourself. It may be on the SaaS provider, or others might let you bring that key. So you need to consider what is your requirement, and then how are you going to score it, essentially. And that's kind of similar to how I was going with the next part of this. Is not only should you have validation criteria, but then grouping them and prioritizing them so that it's, like I said, as easy as possible to reduce ambiguity and say, this is a yes or no, true or false. I can, quickly convert that into a score and say, this is our winner. So continuing this along, part 2 here, you want to build a response template and a scorecard that's based on your validation criteria. So you want to make sure that you can show the tie of your response template both to your requirements to know that you've met all the criteria, and that also helps ensure that when the vendors provide back responses, you get the information you need in a manner that you can score. I guarantee vendors are bad at this. Somebody's going to mess up, right? They will either not understand your template, they're going to not want to provide it in the way that you've asked for it because it's either more work on their part to configure their data to fit your template. They may want to hide something, right? Your template may bring up some points that they don't have a good answer to, and it may not be in their best interest to provide the information the way you want. So as best as you can, you want to guide them to give you the information you need. So for example, if you need to know pricing by region, by criteria, or however way you need to do that to be able to make a decision, you want to give them all of those templates and forms built out as best you can and as populated as you can with as much information as you can give them. There's no right or wrong way to come up with how you're going to score it, right? The goal is to be able to make a decision, choose a vendor, and show that you're unbiased in your approach, that you had some data and you were able to quantifiably say, yes, we picked them because of X. There's lots of approaches to this. You can come up with weightings to say, well, this criteria is more important than that criteria, or you can give everything a straight score of if it's yes or no, it's 1 or 0, right? It doesn't ultimately matter as long as you can meet these goals and make the decision. Talking about the proof of concepts, right, and how many vendors to include. The risk you're running is if you choose a single vendor early on and they fail, you're going to have to go all the way back to the beginning and go through the whole RFP or potentially go back to the next best supplier in your list and try to bring them all the way through the process. And what happens again if they fail? So bringing a couple vendors through a trial period can give you a better outcome, potentially that at least one of them is going to give you what you need. So it really comes down to how confident are you that they'll be able to provide what you want. And you may not need to do the POC. You may be very confident that, you know what, I've had business with them in the past. This has worked out well. I'm sure that we're fine with giving their responses. That's really the criteria that I think you should use when you're looking at, should I do a POC or not? All right, so what about references? A lot of times we'll ask for a vendor to provide references of other companies that are using their services. You should always keep in mind a couple of things. First is they're only going to provide you their good references, right? Nobody's going to refer you to the one that's angry with them. But even knowing that, you can still get a lot of information out of it. One trick that I've seen, trick is probably the wrong word, but a good way to go about this is ask for references for customers that are at different points in their customer journey with the vendor, right? I don't want to just know about somebody that's just exiting the honeymoon phase and is still, really in love with them. I want to be able to see somebody that's been down the line and has seen the pros and cons of their implementation, what failed, what didn't, right? What were the challenge points, etc. Learn from their mistakes. So given here some examples of some questions, right, that you might want to ask whether it's around the deployment, how has their customer support experience been? Are there just general gotchas we need to be aware of in moving forward with this solution? You can try to ask about other vendors they considered and why they ultimately chose the supplier. A lot of times people are hesitant to talk about that one, but sometimes you'll get some information there. And then ask them about what are the things that they actually like or use in this solution, because they may have chosen them, even though it might provide it seems to provide the same capabilities to both companies. They may have chosen them for a very different reason, and they may like it for something that is not ultimately that important to you. It could be it had a certain reporting capability that they needed to meet some sort of compliance requirement. You might not fall into that compliance framework, and maybe you don't care because you're not going to have to provide that report. So it's good to figure out why did they like it, even if it's something that ultimately is not a bad thing or even applicable to you, but it helps give context to their response. All right, so a couple examples here. Like I said, choosing a car, right? So ultimately, requirements drive everything, and requirements also include personal preferences. That is okay. You are saying, I want a certain type of report. I want a certain color. I want the ability to change the colors, right? Whatever it is, you're the one who has to live with this decision and the thing that you are purchasing, whether it's a staff augmentation where people are coming in and helping you with things, whether it's consulting services or whether it's hardware or software. So certain things may not be negotiable, and maybe you don't really provide them a weight in terms of the score, right? It's either all in or all out, whether you meet the budget, right? For example, for a car, or whether number of passengers. Maybe I have a large family. I need something that can hold 10 people. There's no way I'm looking at a Mazda Miata, right? It's just not negotiable, unfortunately. Would love to, but it's just not practical. And then, for all these different types of requirements around per car, some of these may make a lot of sense to one person. Other people are like, no, when I buy a car, I could care less that my windshield wiper controls are on a separate stick from my turn signal. Other people are like, no, I'm comfortable with that, or I like it. It was in my last car. This is something that's important to me. I want to see this again. And so it's important to go through that exercise, make sure you understand what it is you're looking for, what's important, and put it out there. One of my frustrations is when we do a large RFP and the business wants to move fast and we don't want to sit there and put together our requirements, because ultimately, what's going to happen is we'll pick something, we'll move forward, and then there's no requirements to point back to, and we're all like, why did we pick this? This was terrible. This was a bad decision. And ultimately makes everybody's life easier, and you'll get a much better outcome from an RFP if you have solid requirements to start with. So you can see here kind of high level prioritization, right? To this person, reliability of the brand of the car, the fact that it has a spare tire. Those are two number ones that they care about, right? And then some are number twos, some are number threes. You can see there's some weightings applied to that, right? If it's a number one, that's 25% of the score right there. If it's a number two, it's 10%, etc. And then even for number threes, maybe I don't care so much about ability to turn on and off interior lights, but I'll weight the colors a little higher because that's something personal preference. As long as you are consistent with how you're scoring, car one, car two, it doesn't matter as long as you can keep the weighting consistent. And then you can see you've got multiple stakeholders providing their score. So person one, person two, person three, excuse me. The first couple, they're pretty much in agreement with internal and external color. The first car, person one didn't like that much. It was a 1. Person two was okay with it, didn't really care. Person three also didn't like the color, right? This is looking at the scoring for one car. And so you can see they each put in their scores. Then you can calculate the overall score. So you're just multiplying it out by the weights and then adding them up. So this would be for car number one, an overall score of 8.05. You do the same exact thing for car number two, get each person's input, keeping the weights the same, and then you would compare that score. So if it was a 7, then you'd go with car number one versus car number two. That's a basic approach to how to do this. Here's a different example, not going into too much of the numbers, but trying to give some examples of more of the security requirements, I would say. Right. So cost, financial considerations. I'm not going to go through all of these, but maybe it's talking about hourly rates or different types of rates that you might be looking at. You'll explain how you're accessing it from a operating model. Maybe the vendor is able to support or not able to support. How are they distributed geographically? Do we have an existing relationship with them or not? Do they work well with other partnerships that maybe we care about? So for example, if you're in the cloud, are they an AWS partner? Maybe there's some cost synergies there from if I'm an Azure, a GCP or Google Cloud user, I care less if they're AWS, but depends on what you're looking for, right? I want to see, do they have partnerships that can benefit me or not? I'm not saying this is going to be a question on every single RFP. I'm just trying to give examples of some of the ones I've seen that are more security focused. Also trying to highlight some of the things that you might not have thought of if you're just looking at the solution and not the company as a whole, because I'm going to have to be a partner with them. So I'll pause for a second and let you look through the list. I don't think it do anybody any good to have me read them all. You can see, you could also go through and weight these as well, high, medium, low. Doesn't really matter as long as everybody agrees that this is how we're going to score the vendors that go through the process. All right. So a couple of things not to do. I realize I'm running ahead of the time, so we may have a lot of Q&A. So first one is, do not lie to vendors or keep them in suspense, right? The goal, and we're going to talk about this on another slide as well, a little more in depth, is the goal is a win-win for everybody. Vendors talk amongst themselves. That's number 3 on here, right? If you are really mean to vendors, they're going to find out, they're going to talk, they're not going to want to work with you. You want to be able to give them the information they can, don't waste their time. If you're not going to choose them, let them know as soon as you can. Yes, there are some reasons from like a price negotiation perspective where you might want to you have one as your secondary, one as your primary, and play them off one another to try to get to a better price. But ultimately, you don't want to price gouge them either, because again, if they are not making money, they're not going to want to do business with you. If you need more time, tell them you need more time. If you need to hit a specific budget goal, tell them, be upfront. Keep that as part of your requirements. Put it out there. Say, requirement number 1 must come in under X amount. And so the more information you can provide to them, the easier it'll be for them to give you the information you need to make a decision, and the easier it'll be for you to come to a decision. Don't do everything yourself. So have the vendors do the work as much as possible. This is a lesson learned from a relatively recent one, right? Make the vendor build the model, financial models for you. If you need to have them show you, I want to see how this works out over 5 years or by quarter or whatever it is, have them do it, and then you can validate. But that way, if they make a mistake, you can hold the vendor accountable. Whereas if you do all the work and you make assumptions and you don't have them validate the assumptions in writing, there's nothing to hold them accountable to. You can also use this to validate and have them demonstrate that they know what they're talking about, right? Have them come up with the deployment strategies, have them come up with the processes, have them come up with drawing diagrams for you. Make sure that they are customizing it to your needs, and that you feel comfortable that what they are providing is ultimately what you need, and that you're not, they're not selling you something that doesn't exist. The last one on here, number 4, is don't avoid internal stakeholders you don't like working with. Right? There are plenty of times where there are people that you may not be, may not be your favorite people. They may be very challenging individuals to work with. If they are a stakeholder in the process, if you try to shortcut them, ultimately they may be a blocker, right? You may not be able to move forward. You may be cut out of other decisions in the future. It just doesn't ultimately end up working. Obviously, if you're having challenges, you need to work with them and or work with your leadership to be able to come to a resolution and be able to move through the process. If you try to avoid them, it typically is not going to work out well. All right, so giving this as an example, this was actually a exercise I did in college. And it stuck with me. It made a good impression. You're trying to get to a win-win situation, right? So we have this situation where one person is told, you're a pharmacy company, you want to purchase 300 oranges, you're only going to use the outside, the rinds, right, to come up with this new compound. The other person's told, well, you're a juice company, all you want to do is purchase 300 oranges and you're going to make fresh squeezed juice, but you could care less about the rinds. You're not told that, right? You're told you just want oranges to make juice. Well, there's a problem because there's this orange supplier. You're told there's only 300 oranges. You guys got to figure out how to make this work. So you don't know what the other person needs. What you do need to do is you need to ask as best you can, and you need to listen and actively listening to understand what are their requirements. You want to think objectively about what you want and don't assume you know what the other person or other party wants. Obviously, there is a solution here. One company can use the oranges for juice. One can use the rinds to make their pharmaceutical compound. Everybody's happy. There's still only 300 oranges, but we've solved the problem. When you're going through negotiations for an RFP, that typically is the case as well. The person supplying the solution or service, right? As long as you are reasonable with your assumptions and your requirements and you can communicate it to them, you can come to some sort of resolution that will be a win-win for everybody. Or worst case scenario, you have to say, okay, they can't hit your price requirement or whatever it is, or it's just not in their interest. They're like, nope, we're never going to supply this requirement. I'm sorry, it's not on our roadmap. We have no interest in this. We've looked at it as a business and this is just not something we're going to do. But let's figure that out now and not 6 months after we sign the contract and realize, you know what, this is not something that they're ever going to do for us, and we're going to go have to find a new solution. So as much as possible, coming together, negotiating, talking, communicating, and getting on the same page. All right, so you chose a vendor. Now what? Like I said, I'm kind of skipping over the contracting piece. That could take a very long time. Well, let's assume we got that out of the way now as well. You have to go through, and this is just high level. A lot of you may have been through this before, but you're going to kick off your project, right? It's always helpful to have a project charter, make sure everybody understands the scope of what you're trying to do, the outcomes and objectives. Make sure you have everybody that you need to communicate with and coordinate with from a stakeholder perspective. You're going to onboard those vendors, make sure they have whatever access they need, whatever materials, prerequisites, etc. You're going to come up with and refine really the plan and the schedule with that vendor. You're going to set up budgets probably to track the spending and all the stuff you have to do to implement. You're going to actually do the work, right? And so this could take, literally years. It depends on what you're trying to do and how you're trying to roll it out, or it could be quite short. You're going to manage those work activities. You're going to have to track it. You're going to have to report on it. A lot of times, if this is something new that you're implementing, you have to come up with the operating model of these are the three, groups of people that have to use this tool, and this is what this one's going to do. This is what that one's going to do. We all have to agree to it and be able to actually use the tool as a team. And then also, standard operating procedures, documentation around it, training people, making sure all that gets done. And then ultimately, you're going to deploy this solution and you're going to close out the project. So any closeout documentation you have to do, whether it's from a financial perspective or whether it's, just project documentation, you're going to hand it over typically to an operations team that's going to maintain it and keep it moving throughout its life cycle. You're going to document your lessons learned, go through post-project readout, and then ultimately don't forget to celebrate your success. You made it. You've got this thing deployed. You're live. Congratulations. So obviously, we're not going deep into all this, but I did want to say, just kind of close out as you finish up an RFP. Really, you just kicked off a whole new project. All right. So in summary, I think the key here is detailed requirements, making sure you can tie those requirements to your validation criteria, having a way that you can score it, making sure the vendor does the work, and then trying to get to a win-win situation for everyone. I think those are the primary keys to make sure you have a successful RFP. So I apologize that I'm a little early, but hopefully this was interesting. And if anybody has questions, I'm here.
Early is not a bad thing. When you're done talking, you have to stop, I guess. Anyway, yes, thank you. Sounded very interesting as usual. A lot of material here that many students probably have never even contemplated before. So I'm glad you brought it to us and sort of packaged it up and put it into the cybersecurity context. Students, if you have any questions, this would be a great time to bring them forward. Feel free to either post them in chat or go ahead and raise your hand and you can ask them out loud. I'm not seeing any hands up right now, but I do see someone applauding you.
I figured it's an unusual topic, but one I felt like I have seen over and over again, and it doesn't always go well or smoothly, trying to show what it could look like and some of the pitfalls and what to avoid.
Well, looking back over my time when I was in field, I spent an inordinate amount of time dealing with vendors. I mean, it seems like from the value that you get, you spend more time maybe than it's worth. Okay, Ryan has asked a question that says, have you ever heard of a business getting blacklisted?
Yes, not necessarily as an industry whole saying nobody's going to work with you, but certainly from one company to another, I know of off the top of my head at least two that just popped into my head of ones that I know at my own, place of work that we are like, nope, we are not going to do business with them, at least for the foreseeable future, with the people that are there. Let's put it that way. Just given bad experiences, whether it was customer experience, customer support problems that we've had over the years, or just really hard to deal with, and don't want to negotiate, don't want to come and be a partner, essentially.
Next question, Mr. Sousley asks, when speaking with vendors, you're saying to be upfront with your budget requirements. Shouldn't you be somewhat more cryptic and play the negotiation game, so to speak, to better negotiate a better deal?
Yes, depends. There's no clear-cut answer here, but I would say that if you know for sure that you have a budget restriction and you're not going to exceed something, then you can always play the game, right? You could lower that bar and try to get them to come in even lower. But you ultimately know, I shouldn't say you should ultimately know. Typically, you know a range of what something should cost. You may want it to be lower or towards the low end of that range, but you have a general idea. You know what the average cost of somebody's time is worth, right? Or a solution is worth, and you can get that information even before you talk to RFP or talk to suppliers. You can, again, go to people like Gartner, and there's other consultancies out there like Gartner. They can give you a range, right? And they can tell you, this is how this type of product or solution is typically priced. It's usually tiered. It's usually volumetric. And, for this number of licenses, it's roughly in this ballpark, that kind of thing. So before you even start talking to vendors, you typically have an idea of what it's going to cost you. If it's already astronomically outside your budget, then you should be asking yourself, well, should I be even doing this RFP? Is this just a waste of everybody's time, right? If you know that it's going to be super expensive and there's no way you can do it, you could do an RFI. You could say, is there a way to do this for under this amount of dollars, right? So there's ways to approach it while still leaving yourself some leverage for negotiation. But you're right, there could be reasons why you don't want to disclose that. Especially if you know the ranges and you're very confident that the vendors are going to come in and you're trying to get them all to go to the low end. You don't have to do that. It really depends on your requirements and what you're trying to get out of it.
Okay, and Alyssa has asked, when you're working with vendors, have you been in a situation in your experience where vendors hide certain security flaws or vulnerabilities in their tools or products?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I would say is vendors tend to try to gloss over how much work it will be to do something. They don't want to necessarily get into the details. They're like, oh, we'll figure it out as part of the implementation. Well, if I want to try to, properly estimate for something, that can be very challenging if they're not willing to work with me to come up with those estimates up front. So I see it more there where they gloss over the details. They don't want to talk about or figure out up front how much effort something's going to be. But I would not say that they try to hide, known flaws. Typically what we'll do is we'll go through the requirements with them and ask them to demonstrate them in some manner. And so at least the technical ones a lot of times. And so those types of things will come out, but it is on you to some extent to kind of poke and prod, right? If they know, I'm trying to think of a good example. One's not coming to mind, but I've definitely been on like some product demos where there seems to be a feature that you would think would come along with this, and you'll ask about it, and they'll be like very sheepish around, oh, actually, we haven't quite rolled that out yet, but it's on our roadmap. When? Great question. It might be 3 years from now, but it's on our roadmap. So they'll do things like that, but they won't actively try to hide usually something that's an actual flaw or a vulnerability, because that's going to be a legal risk to them. And they're not usually wanting to go that direction.
And it might take you back to Ryan's original question about blacklisting.
Yes.
Word does get around. I mean, I know when I was doing this, we talked to our competitors and peers in the industry about vendor issues all the time. Yeah. ISSA meetings are good for that too.
Sure.
Okay. Any other questions for Joseph? Okay. Don't see any hands. I don't see any more texts. So Joseph, I want to thank you again for coming out this evening and talking to us. Sure. We appreciate your time and your effort. And we're going to have a short intermission now for about 15 minutes. And then at 8 o'clock, we will resume with our next speaker. So thank you, Joseph. Appreciate your time.